Hello and welcome. I'm Brad Barron of the University of Kentucky College of Engineering and also the James B. Beam Institute of Kentucky Spirits. So today's educational video, we're going to be responding to an email question about the use of a bourbon still system to produce a 190 proof product. In reality, this video is more of an opportunity for us to go in and really explore the basics of continuous bourbon production. But I think this sort of framing it around the need for hand sanitizer production is an interesting way to sort of twist the conversation a little bit. So with that, let's look at our overall challenge. Today we're going to be looking at a question I got by email that I think is an interesting opportunity to sort of consider what we can do with a traditional beer still used for bourbon production and the doubler system to actually produce 190 proof spirit. So this is a conceptual question we got and we started thinking through, and just in case you're really burning to know the answer and don't want to listen to the entire video, the answer quickly is technically yes, we can do that, but the process is prohibitively inefficient. You're going to waste a lot of alcohol and a lot of energy getting to this point, so ultimately I wouldn't advise it. But what I'd like to do is use this as an opportunity for first to look at how the bourbon system works using the traditional column beer still and a doubler. And then second, we're going to look to see what would happen if we use that same equipment to do some redistilling. So whether we modify the beer column or we start trying to modify the doubler or use the doubler in multiple iterative processes. So first, let's start talking about how the beer column works in the traditional bourbon production process. So looking at the standard beer column in a bourbon production facility, what we're going to see is coming in the front end, we've got beer and grain coming in at about 10% ABV. And coming out the top is really going to be what's going to eventually become our product. This is something that's referred to as low wines. It's going to be about 65% ABV. We're going to condense that and then send it over to the doubler. So coming out the bottom of the column, we've got stillage, which is really just water and grains. So this beer column is really just a really tall distillation column, and what you would expect to see is a really tall column, usually about 30 feet tall. And inside there, you've got about 20 trays acting as mini stills. So I've drawn each one of those trays sort of just as a simple line here. But on each one of those trays, there's the opportunity for alcohol to go up because we've got sort of a still boiling that liquid. We've got water going down, and then the grains are going down the column as well. So when we look at overall what's happening in this system, we've got energy being provided to the beer column through steam. So basically we're injecting pure water at the bottom of this. So that water is generating energy to basically boil everything throughout all of these individual little mini trays acting as mini stills. And also it's adding water to more or less start thinking about how we can strip the alcohol off of these grains before they go out as stillage. When we look at how the overall column is working and what job is being accomplished in each section of the column, we can look really at these bottom, 15 plus trays. Their entire goal of this entire bottom section of the column is actually to strip the alcohol from these grains. So we want to make sure as little alcohol as possible is coming out in this stillage, and we're really just sending water and grains off to the cattle, so we're not losing any of our product. And really it's only this small top section of the column. We're looking at these probably top 3, maybe 4 trays, depending on how your system's configured. That's what's actually concentrating the alcohol into a product. So in this section, we're actually jumping from 10% ABV to roughly 65% ABV, and that's really the concentration side. So most of this column is used for stripping alcohol from the grains, and then only a small section of this column is actually used to actually increase the proof of what's coming out and going to the doubler. So now if we think about trying to adapt our beer column and maybe take the final product that's coming out of our bourbon system and rerun that back into the front of this beer column or this beer still, we might think about the concept of pumping in high wines, which would be around 70% ABV, and sending it into this exact same column. So out the bottom we'd have stillage, but since we don't have grains in the system, we'd be letting water out. And ultimately what we're going to be seeing in this adaptation of this column is we'd also be sending alcohol out the bottom of this column. When we look at what's going on in terms of adding things to this column, the first challenge we have with rerunning this system using high wines is first, we're pumping in steam as our energy source for all of the boiling in here. So in addition to adding energy, by having open steam heating, we're adding pure water to the system. So you might imagine that we're basically just mixing in water with the product that we already worked really hard to generate at high concentrations of alcohol. So ultimately we're watering down our alcohol, and then what's coming out the top really isn't that much improved in terms of the proof. We might see 1 or 2 points improved in terms of percent ABV, but really not a significant change. So what's really happening is we're having steam heating diluting our product. We're going to be losing alcohol out the bottom of the still because ultimately all of this material that's coming up and down really has to go somewhere. So we're going to be really losing some water and alcohol out here. We're losing product output, and really only the top 3 stages are going to be concentrating the product. So really we're not getting much improvement in this ABV, and we're losing a lot of alcohol. The other challenge we'd have running this way, this is more of a side note for people who sort of follow some of these columns, really the entire running of this column is driven by getting separation through additional stages, and also getting separation by introducing liquids back from this beer heater straight down. So this term is called reflux, sending some of this concentrated alcohol down the column. So the beer heater is really what's providing the reflux and what's really driving the operation of this entire column system. We don't have time to get into all the details of how reflux drives that, but ultimately if we don't have cooling in this beer heater, we're not going to have any real operation of this column whatsoever. So ultimately we would have to cool our high wines that come out at the end of the system considerably down, probably closer to room temperature, to even expect to get any kind of mediocre performance out of this system. So ultimately, rerunning on the beer column, we are diluting our product down. We're not really seeing much of an improvement in ABV coming out the top of the system. And we'd also have to put in a lot of energy to cool down our high wines before we'd rerun. So ultimately, this is sort of a lost exercise. Now, if we look later in this system, if we look what comes out of the beer column, we would condense that down in the low wines condenser and send that over to the doubler. So under the normal operation of the doubler, you're sending in low wines, which is usually about 65% ABV. We get liquid accumulating in this doubler. We're adding heat to the system through a steam source, which is not open steam heating, so we can actually have a chance to improve this ABV. And then coming out the top is our high wines, usually on the order of about 70% ABV, and we would then condense that down, send it to the cistern, proof it down, and this is what would go into a barrel. The beauty of trying to work with this system and trying to use that as a way of increasing the proof of our product, if we're trying to, say, try to push towards 190 proof, is in this system we don't have any dilution issues, and we also don't have any heating cooling issues because we would be cooling with the condenser before, and we'd also be heating with a not open steam source. So we're not adding water when we're adding heat. So we could potentially rerun the doubler to get higher proof. That theoretically works. So that would also work very similarly to what we might do with a pot still and try to run multiple batches doing that. But ultimately, the practice of this isn't really feasible, and we're going to look a little bit at still performance and try to understand why. So what I have here is the start of a table where we're comparing really the alcohol concentration in the liquid. What we would have if we had a perfect still, so an ideal still, something that's theoretically possible, so we could potentially send it up to roughly 50% off of a 10% beer. And then we also have what we would really get off of a still, and this number is actually based off of what I see in terms of column still performance off of a single tray or a single stage, but we're using this here just for the conversation. So really we're seeing about a 20% change in terms of composition as we use one distillation process. So as we move higher in concentration of alcohol, as we start to concentrate that alcohol, we're still seeing roughly 20% as we go from 30% to a 50% vapor product. So 2 distillations would get us roughly 50% using a column still, and if we go for a third stage, we'd see something like a 65% product coming off of a 10% liquid. So here we're basically looking at the difference we're getting every time we would do some sort of simple distillation product, and if we could do things ideally, we'd be much more successful. The challenge comes as we move to higher concentrations of alcohol, the difference between the concentration of alcohol in the liquid and the concentration of alcohol in the vapor we get off of a real still starts to decrease. Here we're only looking at about 5% when we start getting up about 70%. And finally, when we get to 80% alcohol in that liquid phase, which is really, this is the target, what we want for our final sanitizer without any kind of additives. The formulation we used at UK was going for us 80% product. Really, without any of the dilutions and additives that we have associated with formulating that hand sanitizer, this is really the minimum we're looking for. We really need to get higher. But now every distillation we're doing at 80% is really only generating maybe a 3-4% difference in terms of the concentration before distillation and the concentration after distillation. So if we wanted to go higher concentration, we'd have to do many distillations. And when we get up to even 90% alcohol in the liquid phase, here we're really only looking at maybe a 1% change every time we do a distillation. And this is why it's incredibly challenging to use something like a pot still or a doubler to try to get up to something like 190 proof that we would want to be using to formulate hand sanitizer. So we would need many more distillations to get ourselves up around 95% alcohol or 190 proof. I'll also note that the regulations are relaxed, so we're not necessarily required to go up to 190 proof, but this makes your dilutions to get down to 80% sanitizer a lot easier. So we don't necessarily have to go to 95% for hand sanitizer anymore, but still, we still face this major challenge of going to many distillations to get significant changes in alcohol concentration once we're already up relatively high. So this is why when people start looking at trying to produce high concentrations of alcohol, people use really large column stills with many trays above the feed, or use a separate column that doesn't use open steam heating that has a rectifying section that can really drive that concentration. And you need many stages to really try to drive that concentration up towards 190 proof. So ultimately, why this question wasn't a great opportunity to really drive the production of hand sanitizer is a good opportunity for us to consider how a bourbon column still works and consider the theoretical limitations of that system and the practical limitations of that system. So if you guys have any more questions, happy to follow up by email. Contact me at bradbarron@uky.edu. Thank you.